A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, continued. Cassette 1, Side 2. They brought jays here from all over the United States to look down that hole every summer for 3 years. Other birds, too. And they could all see the point, except an owl that come from Nova Scotia to visit the Yosemite. And he took this thing in on his way back. He said he couldn't see anything funny in it. But then he was a good deal disappointed about Yosemite, too. Chapter 4. Student Life. The summer semester was in full tide. Consequently, the most frequent figure in and about Heidelberg was the student. Most of the students were Germans, of course, but the representatives of foreign lands were very numerous. They hailed from every corner of the globe, for instruction is cheap in Heidelberg, and so is living, too. The Anglo-American Club, composed of British and American students, had 25 members, and there was still much material left to draw from. 9/10 of the Heidelberg students wore no badge or uniform. The other 10th wore caps of various colors and belonged to social organizations called corps. There were 5 corps, each with a color of its own. There were white caps, blue caps, and red, yellow, and green ones. The famous duel fighting is confined to the corps boys. The knipe seems to be a specialty of theirs, too. Knipes are held now and then to celebrate great occasions, like the election of a beer king, for instance. The solemnity is simple. The 5 corps assemble at night, and at a signal they all fall loading themselves with beer, out of pint mugs, as fast as possible, and each man keeps his own count, usually by laying aside a lucifer match for each mug he empties. The election is soon decided. When the candidates can hold no more, a count is instituted, and the one who has drunk the greatest number of pints is proclaimed king. I was told that the last beer king elected by the corps, or by his own capabilities, emptied his mug 75 times. No stomach could hold all that quantity at one time, of course, but there are ways of frequently creating a vacuum which those who have been much at sea will understand. One sees so many students abroad at all hours that he presently begins to wonder if they ever have any working hours. Some of them have, some of them haven't. Each can choose for himself whether he will work or play. For German university life is a very free life. It seems to have no restraints. The student does not live in the college buildings, but hires his own lodgings in any locality he prefers, and he takes his meals when and where he pleases. He goes to bed when it suits him, and does not get up at all unless he wants to. He is not entered at the university for any particular length of time, so he is likely to change about. He passes no examination upon entering college. He merely pays a trifling fee of $5 or $10, receives a card entitling him to the privileges of the university, and that is the end of it. He is now ready for business, or play, as he shall prefer. If he elects to work, he finds a large list of lectures to choose from. He selects the subjects which he will study and enters his name for these studies, but he can skip attendance. The result of this system is that lecture courses upon specialties of an unusual nature are often delivered to very slim audiences, while those upon more practical and everyday matters of education are delivered to very large ones. I heard of one case where, day after day, the lecturer's audience consisted of 3 students, and always the same 3. But one day 2 of them remained away. The lecturer began as usual, "Gentlemen." Then, without a smile, he corrected himself, saying, "Sir," and went on with his discourse. It is said that the vast majority of the Heidelberg students are hard workers and make the most of their opportunities. that they have no surplus means to spend in dissipation and no time to spare for frolicking. One lecture follows right on the heels of another, with very little time for the student to get out of one hall and into the next. But the industrious ones manage it by going on a trot. The professors assist them in the saving of their time by being promptly in their little boxed-up pulpits when the hours strike, and as promptly out again when the hour finishes. I entered an empty lecture room one day just before the clock struck. The place had simple, unpainted pine desks and benches for about 200 persons. About a minute before the clock struck, 150 students swarmed in, rushed to their seats, immediately spread open their notebooks, and dipped their pens in the ink. When the clock began to strike, a burly professor entered, was received with a round of applause, moved swiftly down the center aisle, said, "Gentlemen," and began to talk as he climbed his pulpit steps. And by the time he had arrived in his box and faced his audience, his lecture was well under way, and all the pens were going. He had no notes. He talked with prodigious rapidity and energy for an hour. Then the students began to remind him, in certain well-understood ways, that his time was up. He seized his hat, still talking, proceeded swiftly down his pulpit steps, got out the last word of his discourse as he struck the floor. Everybody rose respectfully, and he swept rapidly down the aisle and disappeared. An instant rush for some other lecture room followed, and in a minute I was alone with the empty benches once more. Yes, without doubt, idle students are not the rule. Out of 800 in the town, I knew the faces of only about 50. But these I saw everywhere and daily. They walked about the streets and the wooded hills, they drove in cabs, they boated on the river, they sipped beer and coffee afternoons in the Schloss gardens. A good many of them wore the colored caps of the corps. They were finely and fashionably dressed, their manners were quite superb, and they led an easy, careless, comfortable life. If a dozen of them sat together, and a lady or a gentleman passed whom one of them knew and saluted, they all rose to their feet and took off their caps. The members of a corps always received a fellow member in this way, too, but they paid no attention to members of other corps. They did not seem to see them. This was not a discourtesy, it was only a part of the elaborate and rigid corps etiquette. There seems to be no chilly distance existing between the German students and the professor, but on the contrary, a companionable intercourse, the opposite of chilliness and reserve. When the professor enters a beer hall in the evening where students are gathered together, these rise up and take off their caps, and invite the old gentleman to sit with them and partake. He accepts, and the pleasant talk and the beer flow for an hour or two, and by the professor, properly charged and comfortable, gives a cordial good night, while the students stand bowing and uncovered, and then he moves on his happy way homeward with all his vast cargo of learning afloat in his hold. Nobody finds fault or feels outraged. No harm has been done. It seemed to be a part of corps etiquette to keep a dog or so, too. I mean a corps dog, the common property of the organization, like the corps steward or head servant. Then there are other dogs owned by individuals. On a summer afternoon in the castle gardens, I have seen 6 students march solemnly into the grounds in single file, each carrying a bright Chinese parasol, and leading a prodigious dog by a string. It was a very imposing spectacle. Sometimes there would be about as many dogs around the pavilion as students, and of all breeds and of all degrees of beauty and ugliness. These dogs had a rather dry time of it, for they were tied to the benches and had no amusement for an hour or two at a time, except what they could get out of pawing at the gnats or trying to sleep and not succeeding. However, they got a lump of sugar occasionally. They were fond of that. It seemed right and proper that students should indulge in dogs, but everybody else had them too, old men and young ones, old women and nice young ladies. If there is one spectacle that is unpleasanter than another, it is that of an elegantly dressed young lady towing a dog by a string. It is said to be the sign and symbol of blighted love. It seems to me that some other way of advertising it might be devised, which would be just as conspicuous, and yet not so trying to the proprieties. It would be a mistake to suppose that the easy-going, pleasure-seeking student carries an empty head. Just the contrary. He has spent 9 years in the gymnasium under a system which allowed him no freedom, but rigorously compelled him to work like a slave. Consequently, he has left the gymnasium with an education which is so extensive and complete that the most a university can do for it is to perfect some of its profounder specialties. It is said that when a pupil leaves the gymnasium, he not only has a comprehensive education, but he knows what he knows. It is not befogged with uncertainty, it is burnt into him so that it will stay. For instance, he does not merely read and write Greek, but speaks it. The same with the Latin. Foreign youth steer clear of the gymnasium. Its rules are too severe. They go to the university to put a mansard roof on their whole general education. But the German student already has his mansard roof, so he goes there to add a steeple in the nature of some specialty, such as a particular branch of law, or medicine, or philology, like international law, or diseases of the eye, or a special study of the ancient Gothic tongues. So this German attends only the lectures which belong to the chosen branch, and drinks his beer and tows his dog around, and has a general good time the rest of the day. He has been in rigid bondage so long that the large liberty of university life is just what he needs and likes and thoroughly appreciates. And as it cannot last forever, he makes the most of it while it does last, and so lays up a good rest against the day that must see him put on the chains once more and enter the slavery of official or professional life. Chapter 5. At the Student's Dueling Ground. One day, in the interest of science, my agent obtained permission to bring me to the student's dueling place. We crossed the river and drove up the bank a few hundred yards, then turned to the left, entered a narrow alley, followed it 100 yards, and arrived at a 2-story public house. We were acquainted with its outside aspect, for it was visible from the hotel. We went upstairs and passed. It was a well-lighted place. There was no carpet. Across one end and down both sides of the room extended a row of tables, and at these tables some 50 or 75 students were sitting. Some of them were sipping wine, others were playing cards, others chess, other groups were chatting together, and many were smoking cigarettes while they waited for the coming duels. Nearly all of them wore colored caps. There were white caps, green caps, blue caps, red caps, and bright yellow ones. So all the 5 corps were present in strong force. In the windows at the vacant end of the room stood 6 or 8 long, narrow-bladed swords with large protecting guards for the hand, and outside was a man at work sharpening others on a grindstone. He understood his business, for when a sword left his hand, one could shave himself with it. It was observable that the young gentleman neither bowed to nor spoke with students whose caps differed in color from their own. This did not mean hostility, but only an armed neutrality. It was considered that a person could strike harder in the duel, and with a more earnest interest, if he had never been in a condition of comradeship with his antagonist. Therefore, comradeship between the corps was not permitted. At intervals, the presidents of the 5 corps have a cold official intercourse with each other, but nothing further. For example, when the regular dueling day of one of the corps approaches, its president calls for volunteers from among the membership to offer battle. 3 or more respond. But there must not be less than 3. The president lays their names before the other presidents with the request that they furnish antagonists for these challengers from among their corps. This is promptly done. It chanced that the present occasion was the battle day of the Red Cap Corps. They were the challengers, and certain caps of other colors had volunteered to meet them. The students fight duels in the room which I have described, 2 days in every week during 7½ or 8 months in every year. This custom has continued in Germany 250 years. To return to my narrative, a student in a white cap met us and introduced us to 6 or 8 friends of his who also wore white caps, and while we stood conversing, 2 strange-looking figures were led in from another room. They were students panoplied for the duel. They were bareheaded. Their eyes were protected by iron goggles which projected an inch or more, the leather straps of which bound their ears flat against their heads. Their necks were wound around and around with thick wrappings which a sword could not cut through. From chin to ankle they were padded thoroughly against injury. Their arms were bandaged and rebandaged, layer upon layer, until they looked like solid black logs. These weird apparitions had been handsome youths, clad in fashionable attire 15 minutes before, but now they did not resemble any beings one ever sees unless in nightmares. They strode along, with their arms projecting straight out from their bodies. They did not hold them out themselves, but fellow students walked beside them and gave them the needed support. There was a rush for the vacant end of the room now, and we followed and got good places. The combatants were placed face to face, each with several members of his own corps about him to assist. 2 seconds, well padded, and with swords in their hands, took near stations. A student belonging to neither of the opposing corps placed himself in a good position to umpire the combat. Another student stood by with a watch and a memorandum book to keep record of the time and the number and nature of the wounds. A gray-haired surgeon was present with his lint, his bandages, and his instruments. After a moment's pause, the duelists saluted the umpire respectfully. Then, one after another, the several officials stepped forward, gracefully removed their caps and saluted him also, and returned to their places. Everything was ready now. Students stood crowded together in the foreground, and others stood behind them on chairs and tables. Every face was turned towards the center of attraction. The combatants were watching each other with alert eyes. A perfect stillness, a breathless interest reigned. I felt that I was going to see some wary work, but not so. The instant the word was given, the 2 apparitions sprang forward and began to rain blows down upon each other with such lightning rapidity that I could not quite tell whether I saw the swords or only the flashes they made in the air. The rattling din of these blows as they struck steel or paddings was something wonderfully stirring, and they were struck with such terrific force that I could not understand why the opposing sword was not beaten down under the assault. Presently, in the midst of the sword flashes, I saw a handful of hair skip into the air, as if it had lain loose on the victim's head, and a breath of wind had puffed it suddenly away. The seconds cried, "Halt!" and knocked up the combatants' swords with their own. The duelists sat down. A student official stepped forward, examined the wounded head, and touched the place with a sponge once or twice. The surgeon came and turned back the hair from the wound, and revealed a crimson gash 2 or 3 inches long, and proceeded to bind an oval piece of leather and a bunch of lint over it. The tally-keeper stepped up and tallied 1 for the opposition in his book. Then the duelists took position again. A small stream of blood was flowing down the side of the injured man's head, and over his shoulder and down his body to the floor. But he did not seem to mind this. The word was given, and they plunged at each other as fiercely as before. Once more the blows rained and rattled and flashed. Every few moments the quick-eyed seconds would notice that a word was bent. Then they called "Halt!" struck up the contending weapons, and an assisting student straightened the bent one. The wonderful turmoil went on. Presently a bright spark sprang from a blade, and that blade, broken in several pieces, sent one of its fragments flying to the ceiling. A new sword was provided, and the fight proceeded. The exercise was tremendous, of course, and in time the fighters began to show great fatigue. They were allowed to rest a moment every little while. They got other rests by wounding each other, for then they could sit down while the doctor applied the lint and bandages. The law is that the battle must continue 15 minutes if the men can hold out, and as the pauses do not count, this duel was protracted to 20 or 30 minutes, I judged. At last it was decided that the men were too much wearied to do battle longer. They were led away drenched with crimson from head to foot. That was a good fight, but it could not count, partly because it did not last the lawful 15 minutes of actual fighting, and partly because neither man was disabled by his wounds. It was a drawn battle, and corps law requires that drawn battles shall be refought as soon as the adversaries are well of their hurts. During the conflict I had talked a little, now and then, with a young gentleman of the White Cap Corps, and he had mentioned that he was to fight next, and had also pointed out his challenger, a young gentleman who was leaning against the opposite wall, smoking a cigarette, and restfully observing the duel then in progress. My acquaintance with a party to the coming contest had the effect of giving me a kind of personal interest in it. I naturally wished he might win, and it was the reverse of pleasant to learn that he probably would not, because, although he was a notable swordsman, the challenger was held to be his superior. The duel presently began, and in the same furious way which had marked the previous one. I stood close by, but could not tell which blows told and which did not. They fell and vanished so, like flashes of light. They all seemed to tell. The swords always bent over the opponents' heads, from the forehead back over the crown, and seemed to touch all the way. But it was not so. A protecting blade, invisible to me, was always interposed between. At the end of 10 seconds, each man had struck 12 or 15 blows, and warded off 12 or 15, and no harm done. Then a sword became disabled, and a short rest followed whilst a new one was brought. Early in the next round, the White Corps student got an ugly wound on the side of his head, and gave his opponent one like it. In the third round, the latter received another bad wound in the head, and the former had his under lip divided. After that, the White Corps student gave many severe wounds, but got none of consequence in return. At the end of 5 minutes from the beginning of the duel, the surgeon stopped it. The challenging party had suffered such injuries that any addition to them might be dangerous. These injuries were a fearful spectacle, but are better left undescribed. So, against my expectation, my acquaintance was the victor. Chapter 6. The third duel was brief and bloody. The surgeon stopped it when he saw that one of the men had received such bad wounds that he could not fight longer without endangering his life. The fourth duel was a tremendous encounter, but at the end of 5 or 6 minutes the surgeon interfered once more. another man so severely hurt as to render it unsafe to add to his harms. I watched this engagement as I had watched the others with rapt interest and strong excitement, and with a shrink and a shudder for every blow that laid open a cheek or a forehead, and a conscious paling of my face when I occasionally saw a wound of a yet more shocking nature inflicted. My eyes were upon the loser of this duel when he got his last and vanquishing wound. It was in his face, and it carried away but no matter, I must not enter into details. I had but a glance, and then turned quickly away. But I would not have been looking at all if I had known what was coming. No, that is probably not true. One thinks he would not look if he knew what was coming, but the interest and the excitement are so powerful that they would doubtless conquer all other feelings. And so, under the fierce exhilaration of the clashing steel, he would yield and look, after all. Sometimes spectators of these duels faint, and it does seem a very reasonable thing to do, too. Both parties to this fourth duel were badly hurt, so much so that the surgeon was at work upon them nearly or quite an hour, a fact which is suggestive. But this waiting interval was not wasted in idleness by the assembled students. It was past noon, therefore they ordered their landlord downstairs to send up hot beefsteaks, chickens, and such things, and these they ate, sitting comfortably at the several tables, whilst they chatted, disputed, and laughed. The door to the surgeon's room stood open, meantime, but the cutting, sewing, splicing, and bandaging going on in there, in plain view, did not seem to disturb anyone's appetite. I went in and saw the surgeon labor a while, but could not enjoy it. It was much less trying to see the wounds given and received than to see them mended. The stir and turmoil and the music of the steel were wanting here. One's nerves were wrung by this grisly spectacle, whilst the duel's compensating pleasurable thrill was lacking. Finally the doctor finished, and the men who were to fight the closing battle of the day came forth. A good many dinners were not completed yet, but no matter, they could be eaten cold after the battle. Therefore everybody crowded forward to see. This was not a love duel, but a satisfaction affair. These did not belong to any of the corps, but they were furnished with weapons and armor, and permitted to fight here by the 5 corps as a courtesy. Evidently, these 2 young men were unfamiliar with the dueling ceremonies, though they were not unfamiliar with the sword. When they were placed in position, they thought it was time to begin, and they did begin, too, and with a most impetuous energy, without waiting for anybody to give the word. This vastly amused the spectators, and even broke down their studied and courtly gravity, and surprised them into laughter. Of course, the seconds struck up the swords and started the duel over again. At the word, the deluge of blows began, but before long the surgeon once more interfered, for the only reason which ever permits him to interfere, and the day's war was over. It was now 2 in the afternoon, and I had been present since 9:30 in the morning. The field of battle was indeed a red one by this time, but some sawdust soon righted that. There had been one duel before I arrived. In it, one of the men received many injuries, while the other one escaped without a scratch. I had seen the heads and faces of 10 youths gashed in every direction by the keen 2-edged blades, and yet had not seen a victim wince, nor heard a moan, or detected any fleeting expression which confessed the sharp pain the hurts were inflicting. This was good fortitude indeed. Such endurance is to be expected in savages and prize-fighters, for they are born and educated to it. But to find it in such perfection in these gently bred and kindly nurtured young fellows is matter for surprise. It was not merely under the excitement of the sword-play that this fortitude was shown. It was shown in the surgeon's room, where an uninspiring quiet reigned, and where there was no audience. The doctor's manipulations brought out neither grimaces nor moans, and in the fights it was observable that these lads hacked and slashed with the same tremendous spirit after they were covered with streaming wounds, which they had shown in the beginning. The world in general looks upon the college duels as very farcical affairs. True, but considering that the college duel is fought by boys, that the swords are real swords, and that the head and face are exposed, it seems to me that it is a farce which has quite a grave side to it. People laugh at it mainly because they think the student is so covered up with armor that he cannot be hurt. But it is not so. His eyes and ears are protected, but the rest of his face is in danger, and he would sometimes lose it but for the interference of the surgeon. It is not intended that his life should be endangered. Fatal accidents are possible, however. For instance, the student's sword may break and the end of it fly up behind his antagonist's ear and cut an artery, which could not be reached if the sword remained whole. This has happened sometimes, and death has resulted on the spot. Formerly, the student's armpits were not protected, and at that time the swords were pointed, whereas they are blunt now, so an artery in the armpit was sometimes cut, and death followed. Then, in the days of sharp-pointed swords, a spectator was an occasional victim. The end of a broken sword flew 5 or 10 feet and buried itself in his neck or his heart, and death ensued instantly. The student duels in Germany occasion 2 or 3 deaths every year now, but this arises only from the carelessness of the wounded men. They eat or drink imprudently, or commit excesses in the way of overexertion. Inflammation sets in and gets such a headway that it cannot be arrested. Indeed, there is blood and pain and danger enough about the college duel to entitle it to a considerable degree of respect. All the customs, all the laws, all the details pertaining to the student duel are quaint and naive. The grave, precise, and courtly ceremony with which the thing is conducted invests it with a sort of antique charm. This dignity and these knightly graces suggest the tournament, not the prize fight. The laws are as curious as they are strict. For instance, the duelist may step forward from the line he is placed upon if he chooses, but never back of it. If he steps back of it, or even leans back, it is considered that he did it to avoid a blow, or contrive an advantage, so he is dismissed from his corps in disgrace. It would seem but natural to step from under a descending sword unconsciously, and against one's will and intent. Yet this unconsciousness is not allowed. Again, if under the sudden anguish of a wound the received of it makes a grimace, he falls some degrees in the estimation of his fellows. His corps are ashamed of him. They call him Harefoot, which is the German equivalent for chicken-hearted. Chapter 7. In addition to the corps laws, there are some corps usages which have the force of laws. Perhaps the president of a corps notices that one of the membership who is no longer an exempt, that is, a freshman, has remained a sophomore some little time without volunteering to fight. Some day the president, instead of calling for volunteers, will appoint this sophomore to measure swords with a student of another corps. He is free to decline. Everybody says so. There is no compulsion. This is all true, but I have not heard of any student who did decline. He would naturally rather retire from the corps than decline. To decline and still remain in the corps would make him unpleasantly conspicuous, and properly so, since he knew when he joined that his main business as a member would be to fight. No, there is no law against declining except the law of custom, which is confessedly stronger than written law everywhere. The 10 men whose duels I had witnessed did not go away with their hurts dressed, as I had supposed they would, but came back one after another as soon as they were free of the surgeon, and mingled with the assemblage of the dueling room. The white-cap student who won the second fight witnessed the remaining 3, and talked with us during the intermissions. He could not talk very well, because his opponent's sword had cut his upper lip in 2, and then the surgeon had sewed it together and overlaid it with a profusion of white plaister patches. Neither could he eat easily. Still, he contrived to accomplish a slow and troublesome luncheon while the last duel was preparing. The man who was the worst hurt of all played chess while waiting to see this engagement. A good part of his face was covered with patches and bandages, and all the rest of his head was covered and concealed by them. It is said that the student likes to appear on the street and in other public places in this kind of array, and that this predilection often keeps him out when exposure to rain or sun is a positive danger for him. Newly bandaged students are a very common spectacle in the public gardens of Heidelberg. It is also said that the student is glad to get wounds in the face because the scars they leave will show so well there, and it is also said that these face wounds are so prized that youths have even been known to pull them apart from time to time and put red wine in them to make them heal badly and leave as ugly a scar as possible. It does not look reasonable, but it is roundly asserted and maintained nevertheless. I am sure of one thing: scars are plenty enough in Germany among the young men, and very grim ones they are, too. They criss-cross the face in angry red welts and are permanent and ineffaceable. Some of these scars are of a very strange and dreadful aspect, and the effect is striking when several such accent the milder ones, which form a city map on a man's face. They suggest the burned district then. We had often noticed that many of the students wore a colored silk band or riband diagonally across their breasts. From my diary. Dined in an hotel a few miles up the Neckar in a room whose walls were hung all over with framed portrait groups of the 5 corps. Some were recent, but many antedated photography, and were pictured in lithography. The dates ranged back to 40 or 50 years ago. Nearly every individual wore the riband across his breast. In one portrait group, representing, as each of these pictures did, an entire corps, I took pains to count the ribands. There were 27 members, and 21 of them wore that significant badge. It transpired that this signifies that the wearer has fought 3 duels in which a decision was reached. Duels in which he either whipped or was whipped, for drawn battles do not count. After a student has received his riband, he is free. He can cease from fighting without reproach, except someone insult him. His president cannot appoint him to fight. He can volunteer if he wants to, or remain quiescent if he prefers to do so. Statistics show that he does not prefer to remain quiescent. They show that the duel has a singular fascination about it somewhere, for these free men, so far from resting upon the privilege of the badge, are always volunteering. A corps student told me it was on record that Prince Bismarck fought 32 of these duels in a single summer term when he was in college, so he fought 29 after his badge had given him the right to retire from the field. The statistics may be found to possess interest in several particulars. 2 days in every week are devoted to dueling. The rule is rigid that there must be 3 duels on each of these days. There are generally more, but there cannot be fewer. There were 6 the day I was present. Sometimes there are 7 or 8. It is insisted that 8 duels a week, 4 for each of the 2 days, is too low an average to draw a calculation from. But I will reckon from that basis, preferring an understatement to an overstatement of the case. This requires about 480 or 500 duelists in a year, for in summer the college term is about 3.5 months, and in winter it is 4 months and sometimes longer. Of the 750 students in the university at the time I am writing of, only 80 belonged to the 5 corps, and it is only these corps that do the dueling. Occasionally other students borrow the arms and battleground of the 5 corps in order to settle a quarrel, but this does not happen every dueling day. They have to borrow the arms because they could not get them elsewhere or otherwise. As I understand it, the public authorities all over Germany allow the 5 corps to keep swords, but do not allow them to use them. This law is rigid. It is only the execution of it that is lax. Consequently, 80 youths furnish the material for some 250 duels a year. This average gives 6 fights a year to each of the 80. This large work could not be accomplished if the badge holders stood upon their privilege and ceased to volunteer. Of course, where there is so much fighting, the students make it a point to keep themselves in constant practice with the foil. One often sees them at the tables in the castle grounds, using their whips or canes to illustrate some new sword trick which they have heard about. And between the duels, on the day whose history I have been writing, the swords were not always idle. Every now and then we heard a succession of the keen, hissing sounds which the sword makes when it is being put through its paces in the air, and this informed us that a student was practicing. One often sees them at the tables in the castle grounds, using their whips or canes to illustrate some new sword trick which they have heard about, and between the duels, on the day whose history I have been writing, the swords were not always idle. Every now and then we heard a succession of the keen, hissing sounds which the sword makes when it is being put through its paces in the air, and this informed us that a student was practicing. Necessarily, this unceasing attention to the art develops an expert occasionally. He becomes famous in his own university. His renown spreads to other universities. He is invited to Göttingen to fight with a Göttingen expert. If he is victorious, he will be invited to other colleges, or those colleges will send their experts to him. Americans and Englishmen often join one or another of the 5 corps. A year or 2 ago, the principal Heidelberg expert was a big Kentuckian. He was invited to the various universities and left a wake of victory behind him all about Germany. But at last a little student in Strasbourg defeated him. There was formerly a student in Heidelberg who had picked up somewhere and mastered a peculiar trick of cutting up under instead of cleaving down from above. While the trick lasted, he won in 16 successive duels in his own university, and by that time observers had discovered what his charm was and how to break it. Therefore, his championship ceased. The rule which forbids social intercourse between members of dueling corps is strict. In the dwelling house, in the parks on the street, and anywhere and everywhere that students go, caps of color group themselves together. If all the tables in a public garden were crowded but one, and that one had 2 red-cap students at it and 10 vacant places, the yellow caps, the blue caps, the white caps, and the green caps, seeking seats, would go by that table and not seem to see it. nor seemed to be aware that there was such a table in the grounds. The student by whose courtesy we had been enabled to visit the dueling place wore the white cap, Prussian corps. He introduced us to many white caps, but to none of another color. The corps etiquette extended even to us who were strangers, and required us to group with the white corps only, and speak only with the white corps while we were their guests, and keep aloof from caps of the other colors. Once I wished to examine some of the swords, but an American student said it would not be quite polite. These now in the windows all have red hilts or blue. They will bring in some with white hilts presently, and those you can handle freely. When a sword was broken in the first duel, I wanted a piece of it, but its hilt was the wrong color, so it was considered best and politest to await a proper season. It was brought to me after the room was cleared. The length of these swords is about 3 feet, and they are quite heavy. One's disposition to cheer during the course of the duels, or at their close, was naturally strong, but corps etiquette forbade any demonstrations of this sort. However brilliant a contest or a victory might be, no sign or sound betrayed that anyone was moved. A dignified gravity and repression were maintained at all times. When the dueling was finished and we were ready to go, the gentlemen of the Prussian corps to whom we had been introduced took off their caps in the courteous German way, and also shook hands. Their brethren of the same order took off their caps and bowed, but without shaking hands. The gentlemen of the other corps treated us just as they would have treated white caps. They fell apart, apparently unconsciously, and left us an unobstructed pathway, but did not seem to see us or how we were there. If we had gone thither the following week as guests of another corps, the white caps, without meaning any offense, would have observed the etiquette of their order and ignored our presence. How strangely are comedy and tragedy blended in this life! I had not been home a full hour after witnessing those playful sham duels, when circumstances made it necessary for me to get ready immediately to assist personally at a real one, a duel with no effeminate limitations in the matter of results, but a battle to the death. An account of it in the next chapter will show the reader that duels between boys for fun and duels between men in earnest are very different affairs.